So, earlier this month, news broke that Disney and Sony were no longer going to collaborate on Spider-Man movies. Negotiations had been shut down, and bit by bit it became less of a rumor and more of a confirmation by the studios and the stars of the movies. In 1999, Sony purchased the movie rights to Spider-Man from Marvel. The deal gave Sony exclusive film rights to the Spider-Man universe, meaning not only Peter Parker, but related characters like Aunt May, Venom, Dr. Octopus, etc. Marvel retained merchandise rights to the characters and could continue to feature them in comic books and cartoon series. Sony distributed Sam Raimi's beloved Spider-Man trilogy and less fondly remembered Mark Webb-helmed Amazing Spider-Man films. The deal continued after Disney purchased Marvel Lock, Stock, and Barrel in 2009. With the success of the Marvel Cinematic Universe and the weak box office returns of The Amazing Spider-Man 2, Sony and Disney arranged for Spider-Man to join the MCU for a 5-picture run. Sony would produce 2 Spider-Man movies that would feature unrelated MCU characters, as well as have Marvel Entertainment honcho Kevin Feige as one of the executive producers. And Spider-Man would appear in 3 unrelated Marvel films. That deal has concluded, as Spider-Man has appeared in Captain America Civil War, Spider-Man Homecoming, Avengers Infinity War, Avengers Endgame, and finally Spider-Man Far From Home. The details of the previous deal are under lock and key, with some sources claiming that Disney received either 5% of the first day or total gross from Sony's Spider-Man movies, while others report that each company kept all the revenue from the films it was responsible for producing. Sony produced the solo Spider-Man films, and Disney produced Civil War and the Avengers movies. Both sides benefited and lost nothing. During renegotiation for the next deal following the end of the 5-picture arrangement, Disney reportedly proposed receiving a larger share of the profits from any future Spider-Man solo movies, as much as 50%. In exchange, they would pay half the production costs. This sounds fair at a glance until you compare production costs to the box office for these movies. Spider-Man Far From Home cost $160 million to make, but its worldwide box office was over $1 billion. Assuming the next Spider-Man solo movie costs a similar amount and makes a similar profit, Disney is asking to pay Sony $80 million so it can take $500 million from Sony's potential profit. Even if these numbers are a little off and don't take the marketing budget into account, this is an extremely bad deal for Sony. Disney has become so powerful in recent years that it's possible they thought Sony, or anyone for that matter, would be desperate to continue to do business with them. Nevertheless, fans of the Spider-Man films broadly sided with Disney over this divorce, insisting that Spider-Man was doomed now that Disney would no longer be associated with the character. Bear in mind that Disney did not create the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Iron Man and the Incredible Hulk were released in 2008. Disney didn't make the MCU. They bought the MCU by purchasing Marvel a year later in 2009. At some point, when fandom of a brand and company becomes a matter of faithfulness, and anything lost from that brand or company becomes a matter of treason, it is no longer fandom. It's corporate loyalty. Standing for a corporation is the very height of bootlicking, a deferential bowing to either amorphous corporate entities that, in spite of what the Supreme Court says, are not actually people, or to millionaire corporate executives who absolutely do not care about us. Sony is not the little guy in this split between itself from Disney. It's a massive corporation. It's only small by comparison, and certainly no less innocent. However, Sony should not be seen as the bad guy either, especially considering the incredible arrogance of Disney to demand Sony lose half the box office to its most successful property. This is particularly galling considering how successful Sony has been without its association to Disney. 2018's Venom went on to gross more than $850 million at the box office, and Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse beat Disney at the Academy Awards. While Disney played a role in shaping Spider-Man lately, all recent Spider-Man pictures, Homecoming, Far From Home, Into the Spider-Verse, and Venom if you count it as a Spider-Man movie, were produced in-house by Sony Pictures. I'm not too interested in cheerleading a corporation, but objectively speaking, Sony made a smart move by refusing to cede more control of its most valuable movie property. But try telling that to the corporate loyalists, some of whom are demanding Disney buy Sony to gain exclusive movie rights to the character, and some of whom are apparently ready to storm Sony offices to demand Spider-Man be reintegrated into their precious MCU. Here's a hot take for these loyalists. The only reason Disney is squabbling over the movie rights to Spider-Man is because Disney completely fucked up copyright law, which itself was already fucked up and worked far more in favor of corporations over labor. Creating, inventing, or naming something is making intellectual property. Intellectual property is intangible creations of the mind that can be legally protected. If a pharmaceutical company comes up with a formula for a new pill, the intellectual property is not the physical pill, but the formula one uses to create it. The pill itself is an intellectual property asset. In superhero terms, a physical Spider-Man comic is property, but the idea that Stan Lee and Steve Ditko had when creating Spider-Man is intellectual property. Spider-Man is owned, now across different media, through a variety of intellectual property rights. A copyright shields artistic expression against copying by others. Another form of intellectual property rights is contractual rights, meaning licensing the right to use someone else's invention. That's how Sony gained the film rights to Spider-Man in 1999. Marvel sold them exclusive film rights via contract, but Marvel, now Disney, still retains rights to Spider-Man in its original form, comic books. In an economic system which depends on disparity between economic classes, the copyright system will, more often than not, benefit those with more capital and resources. Those who can hire the best lawyers, those who can drag something out in court without the risk of going bankrupt due to mounting legal bills. That's why the copyright system, even though it can be utilized by anyone, benefits corporations more than it benefits individual artists and inventors. Intellectual property law has existed for centuries, but it began to change in the United States during the 20th century. Disney has long fought to ensure that the copyright license to Mickey Mouse continues for as long as possible. In 1998, Disney lobbied to overhaul the copyright system to retroactively extend everything created between 1923 and 1977 to a staggering 95-year term. They were successful, so much in fact that the law is sometimes pejoratively called the Mickey Mouse Law. Due to this, Mickey Mouse, at least as depicted in Steamboat Willie, is safely protected under Disney until 2023. Everyone involved in the creation of the Steamboat Willie cartoon short is dead. And the assumption that the Disney company should still be the owner of Mickey Mouse for all time tells us a lot about how we have been fooled into viewing corporations as people. It also tells us a lot about the commodification of even intangible things, like ideas. As for Spider-Man, the web-slinger won't become public domain until 2057. If Disney had not lobbied politicians to extend copyright, Spider-Man would have entered public domain on January 1st, 2019, this year. Disney would have been free to make as many Spider-Man movies as it desired. The news that Spider-Man would no longer be able to interact with characters that are the intellectual property of Disney created a lot of misinformation on social media when it broke. Most notably the idea that this meant that the Tom Holland version of Spider-Man was about to be snapped out of existence. This is untrue. The movies Captain America Civil War, Avengers Infinity War, and Avengers Endgame are the property of Disney, but Spider-Man Homecoming and Spider-Man Far From Home are the property of Sony. Holland has a deal with Sony, not Disney. Holland and Sony have both confirmed that he is under contract for more movies, and that there is no reason for a reboot. The story will continue, presumably where it left off in Far From Home. This misinformation is the likely result of the aforementioned corporate loyalty for Disney. The idea that if Disney no longer has access to Spider-Man, then Spider-Man may as well cease to exist. Sony still owns the movie rights to Spider-Man. Peter Parker in the MCU was an arrangement, not a handover or buyout. Sony would have no interest in rebooting Spider-Man with such a proven winner on its hands, particularly after so many other potential franchises failed to catch fire. The only appreciable difference between what would have been the next solo Spider-Man movie and what is going to be the next solo Spider-Man movie is that it can't reference or feature characters that are the intellectual property of Disney, but that does not actually kneecap the film. In the next Spider-Man movie, Spidey's adventures can continue largely uninterrupted. Iron Man can no longer be part of the Spider-Man movies since he's the property of Disney, but that character was killed off in Avengers Endgame. He couldn't feature anyway. And Nick Fury and Maria Hill, well, weren't actually Nick Fury and Maria Hill, were they? Which means Spider-Man has no meaningful relationship with either of them that could carry over into the next movie anyway. The only noticeable difference between what would have been the next Spider-Man movie and what will be the next Spider-Man movie in terms of rights and intellectual property is Happy Hogan. Happy is a character owned wholly by Disney, which means unless some new deal is brokered, he will not be making an appearance in the next solo Spider-Man movie. That's it. In terms of characters, Happy will be the only noticeable change. And though the flirtations between Happy and Aunt May probably got a few laughs from the audience, it should not be controversial to say that nobody bought a ticket for either movie to see Happy Hogan. Even when with the Avengers, Spider-Man forged no meaningful relationships with any characters besides Iron Man, who, once again, is now dead. Spider-Man lifts out of the MCU better than almost any other major character. This does not require very much screenwriting surgery at all. Another complaint among Disney's corporate loyalists is that it was somehow Disney itself that made the Homecoming and Far From Home movies as good as they were. This is a mischaracterization of the process that went into the creation of both of these movies. Homecoming and Far From Home are not Disney movies, they are Sony movies. Sony did not hand over the creation of the solo Spider-Man movies to Disney and simply reaped all the reward. That would not make good financial sense for Disney. Kevin Feige of Marvel Entertainment was one of the executive producers of both films, but the other executive producer was Amy Pascal, former chairperson of the Motion Pictures Group of Sony Pictures Entertainment and co-chair of SPE in general, including Sony Pictures Television. Her other recent producer credits include the Academy Award-winning Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse and the Best Picture Academy Award nominee, The Post, directed by Steven Spielberg. In fact, Pascal Pictures, founded and owned by Pascal herself, was one of the 3 production houses credited with creating Homecoming and Far From Home. The other 2 being Columbia Pictures, which is a subsidiary of Sony, and of course Marvel Studios under Disney. Homecoming and Far From Home were also financed in-house by Sony, not Disney. Disney did not write the Tom Holland solo Spider-Man movies. They were written by a series of hired gun screenwriters, and since Sony fronted the bill for both movies, the screenwriters were under the employ of Sony, not Disney. Both pictures were directed by John Watts, who until then never had any major dealings with either Sony or Disney. Characterizing Homecoming and Far From Home as Disney movies is incredibly disingenuous. The popular perception of Disney as a monolith in the industry leads to the assumption that Disney was responsible for Homecoming and Far From Home, even though that is demonstrably untrue. They obviously had a hand in it, but were not primarily responsible. Furthermore, overestimating Disney's control over Homecoming and Far From Home shows a misunderstanding about how common it is for a motion picture's primary producer and distributor contracting help from other production houses, splitting domestic and worldwide distribution, etc. Corporate loyalists tend to lionize Kevin Feige as this supreme being who is solely responsible, or at least chiefly responsible, for why the Marvel Studios movies are good. And if that is true, then that is the only reason that Homecoming and Far From Home were good. There are 2 problems with this line of thinking. One is that filmmaking is a collaborative process and that motion pictures are the result of the labor of a great many people. Frequently in film discourse, the director is deified as the sole motivator of a film, which itself is problematic. But it's telling about the growing influence of corporate loyalty in our society that the director has been supplanted as the perceived creative head of the film in the popular consciousness of the moviegoers. Corporate loyalists are now more likely to give credit to an amorphous brand or to a producer, a position that is historically more of a corporate overseer and arranger of finances. Kevin Feige undoubtedly had a major hand in making the MCU what it is today due to his position within Marvel Studios, but the shift from giving far greater credit to a producer than to writers, directors, and other creatives working in the industry is both telling of our shifting priorities and arguably a mischaracterization of the primary reasons why movies end up being, well, good. Kevin Feige is not primarily responsible for the MCU movies being good. He is primarily responsible for the MCU movies being uniform, containing the same style, cohesiveness, and even the same camera equipment used for each movie. That's not to downplay his involvement, which has been quite an undertaking, but that is a more realistic credit to Feige's actual mark left on the MCU. The other problem with the line of thinking that lays credit solely at the feet of Kevin Feige for the MCU movies being any good is the presumption that these movies are, in fact, good in the first place. Obviously, a lot of this is subjective, but it might be more accurate to say that the MCU movies are successful rather than exceptional. They are serviceable action movies, with a handful of entries that rise above that median, or are so grand in scale that they become, at least, very satisfying. The MCU is an achievement in organization more than filmmaking, which is another reason why an executive producer is given more credit than the accomplished creative heads who helmed its most popular entries. Long story short, not much is lost by Sony and Disney having a falling out over profit sharing. Spider-Man starring Tom Holland will continue, and Sony is perfectly capable of hiring successful directors and writers for the next sequel. In fact, word is they want John Watts back for the third installment. He was only originally signed for a 2-picture deal, but he may be back. The only thing truly lost from the Sony-Disney divorce is that Spider-Man can no longer have awkward, small talk with Doctor Strange in a proposed 5th Avengers movie that has not even been announced yet. At the risk of being dismissive, so what? Disney's intellectual property within its shared universe is so vast that losing one character among hundreds will not diminish it. Disney recently acquired 20th Century Fox, which gives them the film rights to the Fantastic Four, the X-Men, and all related characters like Deadpool. They have an absurdly large library of characters from which to choose. The counter-argument that Disney should have everything is effectively cheerleading a monopoly, a gotta collect them all mentality that is extremely concerning both from Disney and its audience. Disney's massive gains in the box office market share, television market, and streaming market should give pause to even the most enthusiastic of corporate loyalists. Disney now owns somewhere between 35 to 40% of the market share, which even at the low estimate is more than twice as much as the number 2. Sometimes this level of market control or merger is rejected by the United States Department of Justice, but both rejections and allowances are often politically motivated. For example, when AT&T tried to buy Time Warner recently, various media outlets reported that President Donald Trump pressured Gary Cohn, the former director of the National Economic Council, to tell the Justice Department to block AT&T's Time Warner deal. Time Warner owns CNN, a cable news channel that Trump believes is opposed to him. It also competes with Fox News, a cable news channel that provides Trump with more favorable coverage. The courts eventually sided with AT&T, but there have been many instances in which the DOJ has more successfully blocked such acquisitions. Similarly, the Trump administration had no problem with Fox selling its movie and television intellectual property to Disney because Fox head honcho Rupert Murdoch is a personal friend to Trump. The Disney-Fox deal is considered a horizontal merger because both Disney and 20th Century Fox were in the same business, making movies and television shows as entertainment. The Department of Justice usually considers this a serious antitrust concern, but in this case and with this president, it happened painlessly and without interference by the government. The Fox acquisition has resulted in thousands of layoffs and cut Fox's upcoming film schedule roughly in half. This means fewer jobs and fewer movies for the consumer. When Disney loyalists shout from the rooftops that the Fantastic Four are free at last, it rings hollow when compared to the staggering loss of employment and loss of options at the box office. Disney does not technically have a monopoly, but it is growing ever closer to that designation. When a private industry has more of the market, they can charge more to the consumer, which is exactly what happened following the aforementioned AT&T-Time Warner merger. Prices went up. It's the same reason your hot dog at the sports stadium, or your popcorn at a movie theater, or your chimichanga at Disney World costs so much. Because they can. Because there is no other option once you're inside. Under a monopoly, the industry can do and charge whatever it wants. A merger of this magnitude is not good for the consumer, and certainly not good for the workers. If the Fox workers even have jobs under the new reign of Disney, they now have fewer options in their industry should Disney mistreat them or not pay them as well as they should. That's capitalism, baby. An economic system that inevitably builds toward incredible private ownership that bestows obscene power in very few people at the top. With great power comes great price gouging. Sony is no angel either, but Disney losing even the tiniest bit of power in its industry is not a bad thing. And no amount of awkward Doctor Strange scenes will ever be more important than keeping an emerging monopoly in check.